One fear that I heard from citizens of the Cayman Islands when I visited there in 1999 is when Cuba totally opens up, it's going to hurt the Cayman tourist industry because the beaches are prettier in Cuba than in the Cayman Islands. And Cuba is only about 200 miles away from Grand Cayman Island, and Cuba is only 90 miles from the U.S. Now, Cuba does have a territorial tax system for foreigners living in Cuba. The tax system is totally different for foreigners than for people that are citizens living in Cuba. They're taxed on their worldwide income. Again, for foreigners, they do have a territorial tax system, which means they only tax income that's made inside Cuba. So you can virtually live in Cuba. Remember, a lot of people think Cuba is an unfree country, but Cuba is actually freer in a lot of ways in the U.S. because you can literally live there totally tax-free with the territorial tax system they've got. Most people don't know about this. You only hear negative stuff in the U.S. about Cuba. Cuba does not have an extradition treaty with the USA and many other countries also. There have been a lot of people that have actually gone to Cuba and escaped the long arms of judgment because Cuba is very strict on not extraditing people. And I had put on another video that the two ways you can keep from being extradited is to get citizenship with a country, and most countries don't extradite their citizens. The other way is by getting residency in a country that just has no extradition treaty. You know, it has nothing to do with citizenship. They just don't extradite people that are in that country. Okay, so this is a good place that you can consider if you have that type of situation. In most cases, I tell people you're better off to try to solve your problem, you know, wherever you're at, because it's just in most cases it's going to be a lot easier if you can just get it solved and rest your mind and put it to peace, okay? But if you feel like you can't, this is a good place that you might want to look at. Now, there are a lot of people who have had legal trouble all over the world that have come to Cuba to start all over again. Now, Cuban citizens had visa-free or visa-free on arrival access to 65 countries and territories, ranking the Cuban passport 82nd in the world as far as travel freedom. It's tied with Guyana and Morocco. Now, to give you an example, as a comparison, because I always like to use St. Kitts as a golden standard for passport, St. Kitts allows visa-free access to 162 visa-free or visa-free on arrival countries and territories. So St. Kitts has got about double the number of visa-free or visa-free on arrival territories in countries that you can travel to versus Cuba. But Cuba, does have a lot of benefits. A lot of people, you hear a lot of negativity in the U.S. on it, but every country has its positives, okay? Extradition is one of them here. Another one is the tax situation. Now, also Cuba, believe it or not, does allow for dual citizenship. They didn't used to allow that. Under previous constitutions, multiple citizenship was not allowed, though the government recognized that persons could hold dual nationalities. The modifications in the 2019 Constitution provided for dual nationality in Article 36, which states that within the national territory, only Cuban law shall be applicable. Now, let's look at citizenship by naturalization. Now, naturalization under the 1944 Decree 358 requires establishing a continuous residence in the territory for a minimum of 5 years and the knowledge of the Spanish language. Residency is reduced to 2 years for those that are married to Cuban nationals or who have gotten children that are born in Cuba. So this is something that you might want to consider. Some of you are going to laugh at this, but if you have a pregnant wife or whatever, Cuba has great doctors. They come up to St. Kitts all the time and practice here. Some of the best doctors we've got here are Cuban, okay? That's one thing that they do try to spend a lot of money on their doctors there. If you take your wife or girlfriend or whatever is getting ready to get pregnant and you want that child to have a Cuban nationality, okay? If they're born in Cuba, then it's automatic, okay? And it might be easier also for you to get, in fact, it will be easier for you to get nationality there. You don't have to stay in Cuba. You can take off and leave, okay? All right? Now, they must comply with legal requirements to obtain citizenship card, to obtain the citizenship card and declare the intent to obtain Cuban nationality. Now, under Article 35 of the 2019 Constitutions, foreigners have that want to be naturalized include foreigners who have complied with the naturalization law and also persons who have been deprived of nationality in their country of origin. This type of naturalization is bestowed at the discretion of the President of Cuba. Now, what about retiring in Cuba? You know, it might not be everybody's first choice, but with this amazing weather, it has good health care and vibrant culture. Cuba has much more to offer than you might actually think. All right, let's look at some of the things that you would be interested in retiring in Cuba. The first one is Cuba a good country to retire in? The second thing we're going to talk about is, can foreigners live in Cuba? Number 3 is, can foreigners buy property in Cuba? Number 4 is living in Cuba, the pros and cons. Number 5, cost of living in Cuba. And number 6, where to live in Cuba. Now, Cuba is a good country to retire in. Very incredibly cheap. Okay, I'm going to give you some rates here in a minute. It's just, it's cheaper than a lot of places in Southeast Asia. Now, with 300 days of sunshine and gorgeous Caribbean climate, a first-rate healthcare system with well-trained doctors and interest in food and culture, retiring in Cuba might be to a lot of people's taste. The USA is only 90 miles away. Now, so what does Cuba have to offer for expats who wanting to retire there? Well, as I mentioned, Cuba does have good weather. It varies between 18 and 32 degrees centigrade throughout the year and gets around 300 days of sun a year. That's really nice. I mean, you're going to have sun all the time. But you must balance this against the humidity. As a relatively small, warm island, Cuba is muggy for most of the year. This is something that many expats struggle with, so bear it in mind. The weather's going to be kind of like Panama is on the Caribbean side, Belize is on the Caribbean side, Jamaica. It's in that part of the Caribbean, so you're going to have pretty much the same sort of hot weather. You don't have that in St. Kitts because we have more of a drier climate and the weather doesn't get as hot as it does in places like Cuba. Now, can foreigners live in Cuba? Now, technically, foreigners can live in Cuba. Okay, now most Americans don't believe that, and they wonder, why would you want to do that? Well, you can live in Cuba providing that you get a visa. Now, work permits and business visas are incredibly difficult for foreigners to obtain, and the only guaranteed way of living in Cuba is to marry a Cuban national. However, the Cuban government is becoming more open to the idea of retirement and has started to initiate what's called a snowbird visa. Now, a snowbird visa is valid for 6 months. It's fairly easy to renew. You need to leave the country, but many expats fly elsewhere for a weekend to reset the visa's clock, and then they just come back again. Now, the first step is getting a tourist card from a Cuban embassy, which you can convert into a snowbird visa in the country. However, visa holders can only buy property under a few circumstances, which many expats find very, very limiting. Now, while there are country club type developments under construction with government backing in Cuba, apartments listed for sale may be leasehold, not freehold, generally with lease terms anywhere from about 50 to 75 years. It's currently very difficult for foreign nationals to own freehold residential property in Cuba outside of international owned complexes. Also, folks, if you want to legally get around high income taxes or how to get a second passport, it's as quick as 45 days to do 3 things. Hit the subscribe button at the right of your screen right here and you get new videos automatically as they come out. Number 2 is I would like to hear from you. If you got a question or comment, put it below. And number 3 is go to our website, www.citizenshipquickly.com, and just ask for some help. Now, the majority of expats and retirees living in Cuba rent what's called a casa particulares, or what's called a homestay accommodation. Now, prices range anywhere from 10 to 30 pounds per night, although you can negotiate significant discounts if you plan to live in Cuba for more than 2 to 3 weeks. To buy property in Cuba, to obtain a real estate visa, you must either marry a Cuban, buy property in the name of a Cuban citizen, spouse, family member, or friend, or buy directly from a foreigner who owns property in Cuba. Now, the most likely option for many is the third option that I just mentioned, although this depends on finding someone with property for sale. As it is the most for most viable options for many foreigners, you might find massive disparity in property prices. You're not going to find a multiple listing service, so that's the thing. It's going to be going to different realtors and trying to find one that speaks English if you can't, if you can't speak Spanish. And most people there cannot speak English, I can tell you. Living in Cuba in retirement definitely has more pros and cons. However, it's worth considering both sides because before making a potentially complicated move to the country, you need to be doing some more homework before you go down there because there is issues and stuff dealing with transfers of money. Let's look at the pros and cons of Cuba. It is a very welcoming country. People are very, very friendly there. But even though expats struggle to buy property in Cuba, the country as a whole is very welcoming. You'll easily integrate into social programs, bars, local expat communities. There are quite a few expats in Cuba, too, that live there all year round. Now, it has great food. Cuban food is a mix of Spanish, African, Chinese, and much more. Now, due to the trade embargoes, Cuba produces almost all of its own food. Luckily, it's high quality, varied, and relatively inexpensive. Cuba is actually bigger than Florida. Most people don't realize that. It's a huge country as far as when you consider it's an island and a country too. But you can. I think one day when it finally breaks apart, the political system they've got here now, I think you're going to see some billionaires being spit out of that system because it has so much going for it. All right, let's look at the affordable cost of living. Now, Cuba is an affordable country if you must bring suitable funds with you. Now, you might have some difficulties with the local currency, though, as you can't exchange U.S. dollars in Cuba. That's one of the biggest problems there. They're real strict on currency conversions and stuff. Now, it does have amazing scenery. Cuba is everything that you want from a Caribbean island and more. It has rainforests, white beaches, and mountains. Combine this with low levels of pollution, extensive natural reserves, and a range of activities. And you could have the perfect country for outdoorsy if you're an outdoorsy type person. Now, they do have top-level health care, although you wouldn't think so, but they do. I'm a witness to it. I live here in St. Kitts. Some of the doctors I've got are Cuban here. I've got a Cuban dentist, very good doctor. This is an eye doctor. This is a Cuban doctor that I go to. Now, the cons of living in Cuba. Now, trade restrictions are noticeable while food is relatively safe from trade embargoes. The effects are noticeable elsewhere. Many cars are old and the new ones are expensive due to the currency's low value. Now let's look at the processes are culturally different. Cuban attitudes to punctuality and timekeeping are very hit and miss, and tipping and even bribery to ensure smooth service and getting things done is in not such a timely manner. It is the norm. It's just like the Caribbean. All these Caribbean countries are the same, okay? Also be aware that driving habits are very different and traffic rules aren't mandatory. Expats have few property options. Expats have a difficult time owning property in Cuba. While rent is affordable, this can restrict people's ability to settle down and enjoy retirement. These restrictions extend to things like owning property also. Now, let's look at cost of living in Cuba. Now, Cuba is an affordable country thanks to its politically produced food and drink. Utility costs and rent costs are very low. And just to give you an example, to rent, you can pay as little as $160 a month for an apartment outside the city center. $160 a month, man, that's incredibly cheap. Price-wise, Cuba is around the same level as Croatia and Slovenia. The cost of living in Cuba is 19% lower than in the UK and 20% lower than in the USA. This is why it features, you'll see Cuba actually put in the cheapest countries to retire list. You'll see some of these retirement pamphlets that come out where now Cuba is actually being put on there because the health care is a very inexpensive place to live. They've allowed dual citizenship. This place is gradually opening up now. I mean, there are lots of countries that are free countries like Singapore that don't even allow dual citizenship. Cuba does, you know. But it's worth noting that currency conversion can be difficult for expats. Unsurprisingly, the country uses the Cuban peso and no longer uses the Cuban convertible peso, which was eliminated at the beginning of 2021. Now, non-residents in Cuba can use the U.S. dollars in the country. Let me repeat that. Non-residents in Cuba can't use U.S. dollars in the country. So if you bring in a bunch of U.S. dollars, they're not going to do you any good, nor can they convert them. If the U.S. dollar is the national currency, consider converting it into British pounds or euros before traveling, as these have favorable exchange rates in the country. So I would do that before you go to Cuba for sure. As a non-resident, non-residents can't make money in Cuba. They must prove they have the funds to live. For an expat in retirement, this could range anywhere from $750 to $1,500 US dollars, depending on where you go in Cuba. Havana is the most expensive area, but smaller towns and cities are far cheaper. Now, for expats living in Cuba on a longer-term basis, there are a few options for money. First, you can bring up to 5,000 US dollars into the country without declaring it, although this might not be practical if you're living there for up to 6 months. You can still use your credit and debit cards to pay for things like to withdraw money at ATMs. Using a foreign card will incur charges up to 12% per transaction. Man, that's really high. Although it's worth noting that you can't use any cards issued by American banks or their subsidiaries. So you need to remember that. Expats with any kind of temporary visa apart from the tourist visa can set up a currency account with the Central Bank of Cuba. The account can hold money in 10 foreign currencies, including the US dollars. Finally, foreigners can set up a prepaid card with Bandac, which you simply just top up in money and use like you do any other card. All right, now let's look at where do you move to and where do you live in Cuba. Now, while expats aren't restricted in where they can rent in Cuba, there are clear advantages to choosing busier and more developed areas. Due to the restrictions on buying options, you'll inevitably settle down in somewhere like Havana or other city with modern apartment complexes. Now, generally, your options will include Havana, and there are other places too, but I think Havana would be the best place because you'd have more conveniences and things like this. And you need something like that, especially if you can't speak the language fluently. The most obvious place to start in the country's capital is a mix of colonial architecture, brightly painted buildings, and extensive history. Havana is Cuba's culturally and political center and attracts a vibrant mix of people. Also, folks, if you want to learn how to legally get around high income taxes and you want to learn more about Cuba, we actually do that program. Go to our website, www.citizenshipquickly.com, and just ask for some help. And I would like to hear from you. If you got a question or comment, put it below. And don't forget, hit the subscribe button at the right of your screen right here, and you'll get new videos automatically as they come out. And I look forward to talking to you in the next video. Take care.